This before, but this is where I wanted to start tonight. And I don't know exactly, I'm going to say 5 years ago, more or less, but Howard Norton was speaking to a group of preachers down at Medill, and his main point for his lesson was very simple, but if you know Howard, Howard's very enthused and very focused on what he says. But he looked at us and he said, fellas, he said, I'm confident that in this life, none of us will know what is the most important thing we did for God. And he let us kind of think about that for a while and kind of turn that over. And then he's going to say it again. He said, before he finished, he said, I'm confident that none of us will know in this life what is the most important thing we have done for God. And his exhortation was, be faithful with every opportunity, because since God is God, he may do something with something that you thought was either not very important or insignificant, and in his own way and in his own time, God may be doing something both to us and through us that we didn't really recognize at the time. Central idea, CI at the top. God often works in our lives in either unexpected times or in unexpected ways. And I want you to just kind of let that sink in. God oftentimes is working in our lives in either situations or during times that we're not even cognizant of. To our knowledge, nothing happened, but when we were in Sydney, we lived next to a family for 7 years. And at different times and they did not go to church. They weren't spiritual people as such, good people, but not spiritual people. And they had some conflicts occasionally, but we were good neighbors, and on and on. And one Sunday morning, we were leaving after church. We were going out of town. We got up really, really early. I felt like I needed to at least mow the front yard one time before we left, so it didn't look like a jungle by the time we got back. And had my clothes laid out on the bed, and lessons were ready, and on and on. And I'm just about finished, and here's this shadow that I can just see right here, and the lawnmower is still running. I turned off, and it's Graham, and Graham says, "Are you sick?" And I said, "No." He said, "What's wrong?" I said, "Pardon?" He said, "You normally have left for church before this time." He said, "I get up in the morning, go get the newspaper at the place, get some fresh rolls, we drink coffee, we sit in our bedroom, and we know every morning when you go to church, and Pam sent me over because you're supposed to be gone by now, and we just wanted to see if everything was okay because you're usually never here." And to which I needed to apologize to my non-Christian neighbor and say, I'm going to take an Old Spice shower. I got my clothes on the bed. We're getting ready to go out of town, everything else. But what did I learn? Here are our non-Christian neighbors, and they were invited to multiple things. They never came. They're very polite, but they never came. They knew what time we left and went to church every morning. Do you see what I'm saying? Sometimes in ways that we may not have anticipated or we may not have understood, God is working to us and through us in ways that we sometimes maybe even will not comprehend in this life. This was wonderful. My grandparents ran the country store from 1924 to 42, lived there until they died in their 90s. And who knows, 20 or 30 years after their neighbors across the street had moved away and they hadn't seen them, I don't know, they either moved to Kansas City, I think, St. Louis, but I'm going to say Kansas City. And one day there was a knock on the door, and here were their neighbors. And they hadn't seen them in 15 or 20 years. And they got to visiting, and these people said, "You invited us to come to church, and we never went. And we moved to Kansas City, and at some point, we got to thinking, we really ought to start going to church somewhere." Where did Luther and Angie go to church? So they've lived across from an elder and his wife and have watched them for years, but never went. They get out the yellow pages in Kansas City, find a Church of Christ, and they go as visitors, and Kelly, someone gets in touch with them and teaches the gospel and baptizes them. And they said, we thought you would just like to know that we're Christians now because we lived across the road from you for all those years and watched you go to church. And while we never went with you, we're now members of the church because we watched you all those years, even though we didn't go to church with you. That's the kind of thing, and I want to try to say it this way. To me, this is really important. Sometimes because we look at these people in the Bible and we think, like for example, none of us are going to build an ark. None of us are going to be the father of all nations, and none of us are going to wear a crown. And we can look at these people in the Bible, and we should hold them up because they're examples of faith. But I'm confident that in his own time, in his own way, God is as active and is working in our lives as much today as he ever was in the lives of people in Scripture. And sometimes we can minimize what God is doing, but at the same time, I think it's helpful for us just to stop and reflect. A lot of the things that God is doing to us and through us, we may or may not know in this life and may only know in hindsight. But here's our aim. I want us to identify how Esther responded to, and here's the term I'm going to use, a defining moment in her walk of faith. And I want to anticipate this. We'll have a paragraph on this later, but Everett Hufford taught at the school in Memphis for years, grew up in Nazareth, deep roots in the church. And one of the expressions that he used in coming from a school situation, he said, as we go through life, we occasionally get one of those unannounced pop quizzes, and something will come up, and we'll either be tempted to do something will happen, and we've all, at the end of the day, thought, I shouldn't have said that. I should have just bit my tongue and not said anything. Or, in my case, sometimes I said, I should have said something. And we've all kind of looked back and think, and we all had these little, he calls them pop quizzes, and then he said, and every once in a while in life, we have a major exam. Our example we're going to come back to again is the men coming to him and they said, all of the camels are gone. And while they're talking, someone else comes and says, they came and stole the livestock. And then while they're talking, someone else says, a great wind came and your 7 sons and 3 daughters were killed. Job then has a major exam in his life. And I think as we go through life, one of the things we need to anticipate is that the Lord disciplines those whom he loves. And this was spoken about very clearly on Sunday night. And I thought Tyler did a good job with this. Let no man say when he's tempted, I'm tempted by God, because God cannot be tempted with evil, and neither tempts he any man. Establish that. Having said that, I just made the quick comment, but there are times that God will test us. And that's a whole different word, and we'll come to that, anticipate that. And one of the defining moments, a major exam, is going to take place in the life, really, of both Esther and Mordecai tonight, but especially will be something that will involve Esther. We're going to start in Esther chapter 4, and notice some points of emphasis just as we start reading. Look at the 5 things we're introduced to. Mordecai, 1, learned all that had been done. 2, he tore his clothes. 3, put on sackcloth and ashes. 4, went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. That's how we're introduced to chapter 4. And look at, again, defining moments in his life, because he has heard the decree that Haman has organized through the king, what's going to take place. The good news is there's a window of time before it happens, and that's going to be fulfilled as we go through and read later chapters in the book. No one was allowed, or he went to the entrance of the king's gate. No one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth, and in every province Wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews. And notice what the Jews are doing, very similar. Fasting, weeping, lamenting, many lay in sackcloth. And when you look at sackcloth, this is a very coarse hair, sometimes possibly goat's hair or camel's hair. I think of something that's an irritant. And he's in ashes. So when Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. And she's a very thoughtful person all the way through the book. And so the first thing she does is that she sends appropriate clothes to Mordecai so he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. And then she called for one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed to attend to her and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. And so he went out to the open square, and this is where Mordecai was, in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. I forget from last week, it was a staggering amount of silver that he had promised to give. Pardon? Yeah, 10,000 talents, and even when you weigh it out in modern currency, it was just a staggering amount of money that he had promised. Verse 8, Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him. And this is what's going to be really important as we walk through this, on behalf of her people. And here's what's interesting, and we're going to see this in just a lot of different ways, and we'll start part of this tonight. A big part of the plot as you read through the book of Esther are continued role reversals. And we're very first introduced to an orphan whose mother and father have died. Her cousin then adopts her. He must be older. He raises her in his own house. And look at the reversal where the girl who was raised up as an orphan eventually becomes the queen. All through the early parts of the book, very thoughtfully and very carefully, she listens to Mordecai. And one of the things he has told her initially is, don't tell anybody that you're Jewish. And she followed his instructions. Now, Mordecai's coming and going to completely reverse what he had told her initially. And that's going to be a pivotal expression tonight, her people. Chapter 4 and verse 9. So the messenger went and told Esther what Mordecai had said, and Esther spoke and commanded him to go back. And here were the first part of the instructions. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except to the one whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. As for me, I have not been called in to come into the king these 30 days. And a little bit later, we do have a paragraph from Herodotus, of all things, a Greek historian that describes some of the background and some of the reasons for this. But what she basically is saying, I haven't been called for 30 days, and if I go in, and obviously he doesn't extend the scepter in terms of the welcome, then this will be at the cost of my life. And this is kind of her initial rationale and thinking as they consider, okay, what are we going to do? They told Mordecai what Esther had said, and we're in verse 13. And Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all of the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish, and who knows, whether you have not come into the kingdom for such a time as this. This is probably the most signature verse in the whole book of Esther. And while she has expressed the reality, this is the law of the Persians, here are the consequences if I go in and I'm not welcomed, then, and I don't think there's guilt involved in this, but just a clarification. And Mordecai tells her, you stand a better chance of surviving by being accepted by the king than by remaining silent, is basically what he tells her. And she is going to look at this, and again, here's the role reversal, here's the contrast. I just try to comprehend the contrast between losing both your father and mother, being an orphan and being adopted, and then now you're the queen of the empire. What a role reversal. Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go and gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Other translations will say, if I'm destroyed, I am destroyed. So then Mordecai went away and did everything that Esther had ordered him to do. When you look at this early expression as this chapter opens, Mordecai, we found out earlier, is oftentimes at the king's gate. There, and I'm using the word network. There's a group of people there. There's people who are talking and things. And earlier, he has found out that 2 of the king's servants are planning to kill him. And that is reported, found to be true, and those are killed. The tragedy is that Ahasuerus, the Hebrew name, Xerxes, the Greek name, he reigns for about 20 years, and the captain of the guard kills him. So these were realistic plots, but Mordecai had some type of a network of people either that he knew, he listened to, and when he hears about the decree, somehow he also has some inside information. He not only has the decree that's been sent, he knows behind the scenes, and this was the amount of money that was promised, and so he knows quite a few things on the inside of what's going on. When you look at this term, sackcloth and ashes, and I just listed a variety of verses, this was just a typical, and I put the word Oriental, Mideastern. This was a very typical outward sign of inward grief. Either a major tragedy, a major death, a major loss had taken place, and the wearing of sackcloth and ashes, both is something that Mordecai and Jews throughout the province are going to do. So in the palace, Esther has been restricted from outside information, so she has no idea about the decree. And here's something I think is very important. One translation would say she was distressed, and the word literally means inside she's writhing in pain. And so 3 things are told by Mordecai. 1, here's the essential facts of the edict. 2, here's how much money Haman is willing to pay to destroy the Jews. And then 3, here's the official royal decree. One of the things I hadn't thought about until working through this, from the time that Esther becomes queen until we come to this part, there's about a 4-year period of time. And one night we talked about when the Persians went all the way through Asia Minor, crossed the Hellespont, went down through Macedonia, and suffered massive defeats, both in terms of on land, and hundreds of ships were lost. And I'd really never thought about this. Xerxes had really created kind of a financial drain on the whole empire. And one of the things that probably was appealing to the king was that look at how much money Haman is offering to do this. He doesn't check about the background. He doesn't check about the conditions. And the verse still just rings a bell. The love of money is the root of all evil. And we see several weaknesses of the king through the whole thing, but in addition to just the greed that was there, he had cost the empire thousands and thousands of dollars in losses that they had had, and that may have contributed to his willingness to agree to do this. When you look at number 5, Mordecai reflected on the depth of Haman's determination to exterminate all the Jews, and he's telling Esther, this will probably include you. And one of the things that still just is very touching to me, his argument is with one person, but he just goes so totally over the top, and he's just going to destroy a whole nation because of that one person. And in totally different ways, Xerxes and Haman are both given to excess. And that's going to be true both of their drinking, their partying, and the other stuff. But rather than just saying, oh, we're going to take care of this one Jew who won't bow down to me, then he has decided to exterminate a whole nation of people throughout the empire. And Mordecai understands the depth of his determination. Esther, do not think to yourself in your soul that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And you stop and think, that's Mordecai. So there's obviously a personal interest in this, but what I think is significant is this. Sometimes when I talk with a couple who are engaged or just getting married, one of the terms I like to talk about is that as we enter into this process of the consideration and all these things of getting married, we're entering into a process that goes from me to we. And so before, we were primarily concerned about what I want to do, what I like, and these other things. And then in the process, then we sometimes need a little time to make this translation where we're thinking more in terms of we instead of me. And then for those of us that are older, you think there's a certain point in time where you think, oh, it's been we longer than it's been me. And a part of, and this is something we talk about in our house, a part of the blessing of someone who's lost a partner getting married again is that they enjoy the relationship enough. And to me, it's a compliment to the deceased, because I know some other people that say, I will never, ever, ever do that again. And the transition from me to we didn't work very well because it remained me and me. And that's a whole different proposition. And this whole thing about, as the older preacher said, the two shall become one, but the struggle is which one will we become? And this is just the reality of me becoming we. Well, in the same way, in terms of identity, she has been told, do not tell people you're a Jew. Obviously, she's very lovely. She's a beautiful lady. She's in the palace. But nobody in the palace knows of her background and this identification with my people. The we part is a part of this kind of defining moment in her life where she now is able to acknowledge this, but the emphasis upon my people is going to become a resounding theme all the rest of the way through the book. So we're on 5:1. Mordecai's question to Esther becomes the foundation for understanding the providence of God that runs through this book. And as we've said this, it makes more sense in the book of Song of Solomon. God's not there. It's a story about relationship of love between two people. But the problem that some people have with the book of Esther is that there's no Jerusalem, there's no law. There is going to be a feast that is going to be started, but all of the traditional things of Judaism, including the name of God, are missing from the book. But here's what I find very interesting. In the same way that the name of God is not mentioned, once you start working through the story and the plot, we see the fingerprints of God at work behind the scenes in the lives of these people, And even though he is silent, he is not absent. Through the years and talking with people who are struggling with, and you fill in the blank, with suffering, or why did this happen, or why did God let my child die, or whatever else, one of the things I've kindly tried to say to people is, do not mistake his silence for his absence. And just because he doesn't speak to us today, as he did to Abraham, and just because he is not revealing himself miraculously to us today, do not mistake God's silence for God's absence. And so Esther's basic options: are you going to risk death initially and hope that he extends the scepter? Or if you remain silent, Mordecai eventually is going to probably find out and he'll have you killed as well. And these are the things that she has to weigh up in terms of the options that are there. Mordecai says deliverance will come from another place. And again, here's one of those things that would be easy to say, and God's going to deliver us. And the writer very carefully never mentions the name of God. But Mordecai says, if you remain silent and we perish, God's deliverance will come from another place. And you look at the fasting that's going to take place. Normally, the two terms that are always put together are prayer and fasting. And this is going to be something that they're involved with. But again, the name God is not mentioned through all of this. This was 6:1. The writer of the book always keeps God in the shadows and the background. And nothing is mentioned about prayer, even though it's strongly implied, or God. And it'll be the fasting. We're going to go without food. If we're with Daniel, we'll have prayer and fasting. But in this book, prayer and God are things that are not mentioned. So Esther's request is, the maidens that I'm with, we're going to do a 3-day no food and no water fast. Mordecai. And see, here's again the reversal. All through the early parts of the book, Esther has very carefully listened to what Mordecai has told her to do. And then Esther, as the queen, says, you go out and you spread the word to all the Jews that are in this capital city in Susa. And I would like to plead for people to have 3 days of fasting, and especially even no water, before I go into the king's presence. If you look at the next page, hopefully none of us will be put in this situation, but how sobering. If I perish, I perish. Lord willing, one of the things we're going to look at next week, I found a kind of a complete paragraph of the short-tempered, ill-tempered, crazy decisions that Xerxes makes as king. And what Esther knows is that, knowing him in a relationship that most people don't, she knows his shortcomings probably better than anyone else. When I was looking at this, I was thinking of Pilate. Augustus dies in 14 AD, and in his will, he adopted Tiberius. Tiberius is 55 in 14 AD. So you start adding time up, and you come close to 30. He's getting on in years. He's capricious. He's ill-tempered. And one of the great leverages to get Jesus crucified is, if you let this man go, you are not what? Caesar's friend. A government official in Egypt in that earlier decade had been told, you're not Caesar's friend. He committed suicide before he went back to Rome to not be Caesar's friend. And knowing how unstable Tiberius was, a part of the leverage to get Jesus crucified was, we're going to tattle on you. And if you hear from us, you are not your life is in danger, and so Pilate, that probably pushes him over. Well, in the same way, Esther understands she's dealing with someone. And remember when we were doing the invasion? Yes, there's a storm, so we send someone down with a branding iron to brand the sea. And then we send another guy with a big chain to give the sea a whipping, because that shows you a lot of stability. So when she says, if I perish, I perish, I listen to this and I think, yes, she knows how just utterly unstable this guy is in some ways. And she's actually putting her life in his hands for him to extend the scepter to her. I can see why I'd like to have people fasting and praying for 3 days before you deal with someone who is that capricious in his decisions. Role reversal. Mordecai went away and did everything that Esther had ordered him. And we'll keep noticing this all through the book, and this is part of the dynamic of the literary way the book is written. All through the book, there continues to be these role reversals. There's an extended text here from Herodotus, and I'll leave you to read some of the details, but basically, he just accounts that, especially if the king grew up and he had like peers and things around him, they sought times of isolation to keep from having extended contact, to keep these people from having too much influence, and the capacity for being killed. And this Persian thing had isolated the king an awful lot, and this contributes to the challenge that Esther has to go in unannounced. So when you just stop and look at the first 3 chapters, there has been a major exam. There's been a defining moment in that Esther has been taken away. She's entered the court. But we come through the first 3 chapters. She's the queen. Mordecai has reported on those trying to kill the king. He's been recognized. Everything is going well. And then the decree comes. All of our lives can be changed by one doctor visit. And all of us have dealt with people, either, again, in our lives or someone else's lives, where, and again, my term is a Job-like experience has happened. There's either some type of loss, some types of tragedy. We're dealing with the news of a sickness or a disease or a death. And this is going to be a part of life as long as we're here. And a lot of times how we respond to those major exams in our lives, those defining moments, will ultimately have a lot to do with how we spend eternity. And it's very interesting, and this is tragic, but through the years we've been with I think 4 families who've lost teenagers. And that's so hard. And one of 2 things is going to happen. It's like you come to a Y. Some people have taken a left turn and said there can't be a God, or he wouldn't have let this happen, da-da-da-da-da-da. And they literally totally turn away from God. And then another family said, now that he is gone, we have a stronger reason to be faithful than we've ever had, so we can see him again on the other side. And the same Job experience causes some people to literally lose their faith, and the same thing will cause other people to draw near to God and to give an additional reason to be faithful. And that's where Haman's edict comes in and just completely changes their whole life. Everything is never going to be the same after that. Here's Everett Hufford, and they were right in the middle of this page. As God develops character in our lives, there are often a series of pop quizzes that will test us in different ways, and there's a whole lesson here. God tells Abraham in Genesis 22, take the son, the only son that you love, and take him to Mount Moriah and offer him as a sacrifice. God tested him. And I'll leave you to read the others, but there's just a series of these all the way through Scripture. And let me try to say it this way. These are things that are much easier to process before we're in the middle of one of these than wait till we get in the middle and have never thought about it. In 2013, I did 35 funerals in 1 year. So I'm doing 2 sermons a week, sometimes 2 or 3 classes, and you add 35 funerals in 1 year. And the first 12 days of 2014, I did 4 funerals. So think about it. If you have a funeral on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, thankfully in the morning, and then you have a Wednesday night class, a Thursday morning class, and 2 sermons on Sunday. Charles knows what I'm talking about. There's just this continual drain that's going out. And on Wednesday, I came home from the funeral and went to bed, middle of the day, because I've got a Wednesday night class, a Thursday class, a Friday funeral, and then I've got 2 lessons on Sunday. When you're with people through this much death and transition, it teaches you a lot about the faith that they had before that event took place. And in this book, where God is not mentioned by name, as we're going to see, looking back, we're going to see God working through these defining moments in their lives, and where some people would either have gotten angry at God, well, just like Job's wife, curse God and die. And what does Job say? Naked I came into the world, naked I shall return. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And if we live long enough, we will have things that test us in different ways, and this is a part of kind of the case study as we watch what happened in these people's lives. One of Everett's comments is that God is a patient God. If I fail a pop quiz, he'll probably give me another one before too long, and I can try again. I don't know about you. I grew up in a family where there was normally a lot of quick response. And maybe because of that, I've learned to bite my tongue, but the same type thing. We've all been in a situation and we've said something, and just as it's going out, we're thinking, I shouldn't have said that. You know, initially I was thinking eraser, and then I graduated to whiteout, and now I've graduated to delete. So something happens, and I'm tempted to chime in and say something, and I keep thinking, delete, delete, delete. Don't say that, don't say that. And it just happens to us in a number of ways. And Everett says, God is patient. He will keep working with us. And the same thing's true with major exams. And at different times, things will happen that will challenge us to look and consider both in terms of who he is and who we are. And this is my term. We all at different times to go through a Job-like experience. So we're at the bottom line, the bottom paragraph. Haman's desire to eradicate the Jewish people brought a major exam for both Mordecai and Esther, and to her credit, she didn't allow becoming queen to go to her head and forget to listen to Mordecai's advice. After becoming queen, some people would have cut off all contact with their past, would not have anything to do with her humble beginnings as an orphan. She will consider and listen carefully to her adopted father's advice, and she will weigh the consequences of her actions. And look at this response, look at her response to this defining moment. 1, she chose to identify with her people rather than her royal robes. 2, she chose we, my people, over hopefully the safety of me as an individual. And 3, she chose to risk her life in order to become an advocate of her people rather than just consider her own personal safety. So here's something, and again, we always have people who are visiting, and you may not be with some of the later lessons, but encourage you to do this. As we go through the book, we're going to identify probably 8 to 10 different role reversals of things that started one way at one time and then at the end are just very, very different. And anticipate this as well. One of the reasons that Esther is in Scripture is that it just defined the circumstances that brought about the Feast of Purim. And again, that had to do with the casting of lots. And anticipate, the book opens with a feast, right? Drunkenness, all the stuff going on, the golden vessels, Vashti won't come in. And the book is going to close with a feast. But one is done with a drunken mob, and the other going to be done with Jews who are going to be drinking. And anticipate this, I'm sorry. Historically, I don't know currently, I haven't been to a synagogue, but historically, during Purim, the book of Esther is read. There's a feasting party and drinking going on, and there is booing every time they hear the word Haman, and there's cheering every time they hear the word Mordecai. So I don't want to be irreligious, but can I say it's kind of like a spiritual pep rally with a little drink going on the side. And this has been, for many of the Jews, other than Passover, maybe their favorite feast of the whole thing. And this has been going on for hundreds of years. But the contrast, the role reversal. One person is at a higher or lower position at the beginning, but as the story unfolds, there is a role reversal and they change positions. And anticipate that's going to happen with Haman and Mordecai as we go through this, and just watch how many times the transition takes place. But it also happens with Esther and Mordecai. And we mentioned this, but let's notice the details. As the story opens, because she is orphaned, Esther is adopted and raised by Mordecai, and you would have to feel a sense of gratitude. Someone has helped take care of me after I've lost my parents. So he is the speaker. She responds, she's the listener. He gives her wise and sometimes difficult counsel. She listens, responds accordingly. Don't disclose your background, so she listens to him. But as she matures, both as a person and as a royal, at some point they're going to switch roles. I try to be nice about this, but in my family, if the teenagers sat with the parents, it wasn't because good things had happened last week. I don't know if any of you got this, but there wasn't any sound made, but we got the look. That's all that we needed. But isn't it interesting, sometimes as older adult children sit with their parents, it's just really a nice thing. And sometimes I think, well, I'm glad they're there, Marvin, for crowd control. And I tell people, we have 2 childhoods and 1 adulthood. And sometimes it's good to have the children with some of our older adults to kind of help to kind of even things out. So we've kind of changed roles in the process as things have gone by. So she chooses the difficult and dangerous. She works through the consequences, makes request. She commits herself to fasting. And as we're going to see, the role reversal is going to continue. Mordecai went away and did everything Esther had ordered him. And so here's this defining moment. What is Esther going to do? And with the help of those who are fasting on her, then she chooses to do the more difficult, and this was the term I used. She was faced with taking responsibility for the life God had given her by identifying herself with the people of God. And she becomes the advocate for her people. The other thing that's going to take place is that through the early parts of the book, Mordecai, Esther's going to be in the middle, and then we're going to come to the end, and the primary of the last 2 chapters is primarily about Mordecai. And we're going to have this continual transition and change as we go through. So I'm at 9:23. The Jews accepted what they'd started to do, what Mordecai told them. There's an honor for Mordecai 10:3, Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to the king. He was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers. So I'll leave you to look at these. These will go very quickly, but anticipate. Look at how this phenomena, defining moment, happens in so many biblical characters, and these are samples. There's many, many others. Abraham, offer your son. Joseph, sold into slavery. Oh, you meant it for harm. God meant it for good. Moses, speak to the rock. He did pretty good the first time. And you stop and think, how many nights did he get to think, I wish I had spoken to the rock the second time? And he's not able physically to enter the promised land. Joshua and Caleb, we can take the land, let's go in. David saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. Defining moment. Daniel, the decree, and then he still opens the window and 3 times a day prays. So the word providence is something we'll continue to talk about. But here's the question: who knows whether you have come into the kingdom for such a time as this? And that's why I continue, and I talk to my kids a lot about this when they were growing up, and we still visit about this occasionally. And you'll continue to hear me say this. We learn more about God through the rearview mirror than we do through the windshield. And just let that sink in. Events will happen to us, things will take place, and then sometimes later we look back and we think, oh, God was doing something that I had no idea was going on. And what God was doing in the book of Esther, he's still doing today. Last tidbit, and you're gone. Thanks for your patience tonight. And again, I've mentioned this in the past. W.B. West told about a 2-week meeting. They brought in a song leader, brought in an outside preacher. In our congregation, we had 7 o'clock services as well. But anyway, this whole church had a 2-week meeting. All this had gone on, and this was the note. And you can kind of see the discouragement. We regret to report that only a knock-kneed 12-year-old little girl was baptized. Leslie, isn't that a compliment? Only a knock-kneed 12-year-old little girl was baptized, and everybody's kind of, going like this. We had a 2-week meeting and on and on. The little girl grows up. She gets married. She has 5 sons. And through her influence, all 5 of her sons become gospel preachers. In the rear view mirror, how did that meeting look 30 years later? And what God is doing in the lives of Esther and Mordecai, he's doing in the life of you and I. And remember, none of us will ever know in this lifetime what is the single most important thing we did for God. So let's be faithful with every opportunity we have.